Hi everyone. In this video lecture, we are going to cover PowerPoint slide lecture 5, and basically we are going to finish the remaining portion of the chapter 3 in the book. So last class we started talking about chapter 3 and we talked about demand in general. In this video lecture, we are going to cover supply and we're going to talk about market equilibrium and different types of government interventions that happens in the market equilibrium. Okay, so we now know what demand means and what's quantity demanded means and how a demand curve looks like. Now we have to understand the supply side, the business side. How are the supply coming into the market, and what are some of the factors that affect supply, and how does a supply curve look like? So that's what we are all going to look at right now. So first and foremost, what is supply? Supply is basically it refers to the amount of a product that businesses are willing and able to create at a particular point of time. So basically, it can be a good or any service. It can be a book, it can be a toy, it can be a car, and if it's a service, it can be educational service, it can be auto repair service. That is basically provided by business who are able and willing to create that at a particular point of time. So again, it refers to the amount of a product, which can be a good or service, that businesses are willing and able to create at a particular point of time. And supply basically comes from the seller or producer or business side. These can be used interchangeably. Now, we saw that demand can be expressed in three different ways, right? Or we can explain the relationship between price and demand through the three different ways. That was the descriptive analysis, the tabular analysis, and graphical analysis. The same tools can be used to describe the relationship between price and supply. Okay, so descriptive analysis is basically when we are using concepts and theories to explain the relationship between price and quantity supplied. We are basically using theories, definitions, and concepts to explain the relationship between the two variables. Then tabular analysis is basically when we have a table with a list of prices and their corresponding quantity supplied, and we try to find out relationship between price and quantity supplied. And then we have graphical analysis, which basically we draw a graph, and based on the graph we try to deduce a relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, so again, just like demand, supply can also, so the relationship between price and supply can be expressed through three different tools: descriptive, tabular, and graphical analysis. Now, before we look into each of these, we first have to look at the law of supply. Remember, for demand, we also had a law of demand which stated that price and quantity demanded are inversely related or negatively related. Well, in case of the law of supply, the price and the quantity supplied are positively related or are directly related. What that means is, if the price goes up, supply of the good will go up, and if the price goes down, supply of the good will go down. Well, that makes sense logically, right? Let's say I am selling telephones in the market, and if I see the price of telephones go up in the market, what will I try to do? I will try to sell more telephones in the market, so I will increase my supply so that I can make more money. So that's why price and quantity supply have a direct relationship. Okay, and if price falls, quantity supplied will also fall, because producers will be discouraged to produce more. So whenever we have a change in price, there will be movement along the curve. We learned it when we looked at the demand, but in terms of the supply, it is the same. Whenever we have a change in the price, there will be movement along the supply curve. There won't be any shifts. But if there are changes in other factors, then the supply curve can shift to the right or to the left. Okay, and the supply curve for the total market is basically the summation of all the supply from all the businesses to the various possible changes in prices. That's basically the definition for the supply curve. It basically sums up the supply curve of each individual businesses at different prices. Okay, now the law of supply, we can look at the law of supply. The first, we use concepts or theories to understand the law of supply, that if price goes up, supply will go up, because when I'm trying to sell something and I see the price in the market went up, I will try to sell more because I want to make more money. So I'm using theory here to explain the relationship between price and quantity supplied, and that's descriptive analysis. Now we can explain the law of supply, basically the relationship between price and quantity supply, through tabular analysis and graphical analysis. So we can draw a graph. So let's say we are given with a table, price, and this is quantity supplied, and let's say price is 10, 8, 7, 6, and then quantity is 5, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and here we can see as the price is going down, my quantity supplied is also going down. Or if we look at the other way, if the price is going up, the quantity supplied is going up. So there is a positive relationship, and this, from the table we can deduce that relationship between price and quantity demanded, and that is called tabular analysis. And then we also have graphical analysis, which is basically we draw a graph to understand the relationship between price and quantity supply. And as usual, like the demand, the supply, the quantity will always be on the x-axis and price will always be on the y-axis. Okay, so you need to understand that supply will always be on the x-axis, price will be always on the y-axis. On the same axis we can draw the demand and supply curve, but in that case always the quantity will be on the x-axis and the price will be on the y-axis. Now based on the graph and based on the law of supply, supply curves are upward sloping. Okay, remember, demand curves are downward sloping, supply curves are always going to be upward sloping because of the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Because when price, look at this, let's say this is $8 and you're going to supply 3 units. Now it goes up to $10 and you're going to supply 5 units. So as you can see, when the price goes up, the quantity supplied also goes up. Therefore it's an upward sloping curve or straight line. And then anytime there is a change in price, let's say it moved from $8 to $10, there will be a movement along the curve, right? So there is a movement along the curve. Or let's say it went down to $7 and then it will produce, so it will come down here. So there is a movement, there is no shift, there is a movement along the curve. Okay, now supply curves are always upward sloping. Now they can be straight line or they can be, like a curve going up. Okay, but for this class we will only focus on straight line supply curves, just like the demand. We will not make things complicated, and we are always going to focus on saying that the supply curves are upward sloping and they're going to be straight line in this class. Now when we go to advanced classes, things can get a little bit more tricky. Okay, so again, we are now considering that the supply curve is a straight line. So basically the equation for the supply line is given by same thing like the demand, but instead we have supply now. QS is equals to A plus BP. Okay, where QS is your quantity supplied, or the amount, the output, or basically the amount of output produced, and P is basically the price, and these are variables, whereas A and B are constants. And in order to find the equation of the supply curve, we always find out the value of A and B to find out the supply function, which can then help us to find out, or draw the supply function and find out different points on the supply curve. And ultimately, using the supply function and demand function, we can find out the equilibrium in the market. So just like the demand curve, I'm going to show an example of this equation, how we can come up with a supply function, so you know how to do that. So let's say you're given with a table, and again we have price and quantity supplied. Now we are only looking at supply and price, we're not worrying about demand for now. So let's say the price is 0 minus 30. When price is 1, it's minus 10. Nobody has any incentive to produce the output. But as price becomes $2, there will be 10 units of that good. Then 3, we have 30. And then 4, we have 50. Okay, so let's say we are given with this table, and then my first question to you will be plot the supply curve. And that's very easy. You don't have to be exact. You just have to show me that the axes are correct and then the shape of the supply curve is right. So we always know supply or quantity supplied is always on the x-axis and price is on the y-axis. Now we see that when price is equal to 0, quantity supply is negative 30. When price is equals to 1, quantity supplied is minus 10. When price is 2, quantity supplied is 10. When price is 3, quantity supplied is 30, and when price is 4, quantity supplied is 50. And then we connect all the dots. So this, this. So it's going to be a straight line. Here it looks like a curve, but it's going to be actually a straight line. I'm sorry, that's my poor drawing, but it's actually going to be a straight line going upwards. And again, it proves the law of supply. As price is going up, my quantity supply is increasing, therefore the supply curve is upward sloping. Now based on this graph and based on this table, find out the supply function. Okay, and how do we do that? It's the same way as we did for the demand. Okay, and we know the function is given by QS is equals to A plus BP, and here A is basically it's the quantity supplied when price is equals to 0. Okay, and from here it's very easy to understand. When price is 0, the quantity supplied is negative 30. That means the value of A is equals to minus 30. Okay, now we need to find B. Again, we can take any point, just like the demand curve we showed last class. We can take any point, this one or this one. We will end up with the same result for B because it's a straight line linear function. It will not vary. So for our simplicity purposes, let's say we take this point and calculate the value of B. So price is 1 and quantity supplied is minus 10. So based on that, we know QS is equals to minus 30 plus BP. Okay, now we know at price 1, quantity supply is minus 10 minus 30 plus B times 1. Price is 1, right? So if we move the numbers around, then what we get is B equals to minus 10 plus 30, or B is equals to 20. Okay, so now we have the equation QS is equals to minus 30 plus 20P. That is the supply function. Notice the value of B is positive. For demand function, the value of B was negative. The reason is demand curves are downward sloping, therefore the value of B will always be negative, whereas supply functions are upward sloping. There is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied, therefore the sign will always be positive. So the value of B will always be a positive number for a supply function, and the value of B for a demand function will be always negative. So this is one way you can check. If you get a positive number for a demand function, that means you're doing something wrong. If you get a negative number for B for supply function, then that means you're doing something wrong. Now given this equation, if I ask you what is your quantity supplied when price is actually 10. Now that you have the equation, you can easily calculate, right? Quantity supplied is equals to minus 30 plus 20 times 10. So minus 30 plus 200 or equals to 170. So when the price is $10, the quantity supplied will be $170. Okay, so hopefully that explains, you can using the supply function, you can calculate the quantity supply, or you can calculate the price. If I give you the quantity supply, you can use it to calculate the price. So this is very important, and using this function we can draw the graph, and ultimately when we have the demand and supply function we can find out the equilibrium, which we are going to look at it shortly. But hopefully now you know how to find out the supply function of a straight line. Okay, so now we look in to what causes changes in supply and what happens to the supply curve when there is a change in supply. So a change in supply is basically a shift in the entire supply line as more or fewer units of products are brought to the market by producer at a given price. So basically when we talk about a change in supply, what it means is the supply curve shifts to the right or shifts to the left. That's what it basically means. The entire supply curve will move to the right or the entire supply curve will move to the left depending on the situation, right? So when we have a change in price, we will not have a change in supply. We will have a movement in the supply curve and a change in quantity supplied. But when there is a change in other factors, which we are going to discuss shortly, then there will be a change in supply, which will cause the supply curve to shift to the right or to the left. Okay. So there are several factors that causes the supply curve to shift to the right or shift to the left. There are basically 6 primary determinants of the changes in supply curve, and they are the cost of production or resource cost, the number of producers, the price of production substitutes, taxes or subsidies, and technology. And I'm going to go over each of these and how it affects the supply curve. Okay, so let's first start with the cost of production of resource cost. So basically when there is an increase in the cost of production, basically let's say I'm in the business of making shoes, and for some reason the cost of my material that I use for the shoes go up, then my cost of production will go up. And if my cost of production will go up, my supply will decrease and my supply curve will shift to the left. Okay. Similarly, let's say I hire labor to produce shoes, and then the wage of the laborers go up, then my cost of production will go up, and as a result I will reduce my supply and the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, so whenever there is an increase in the cost of production, what cost of production means is the cost of the resources or cost of the factors of production, any machinery, cost of labor, cost of material, cost of any type of land items. If there is an increase in the price of these, what will happen is my cost of production will go up, and in response to that I will try to cut down supply, because if I produce more I will be incurring more cost. So I will try to reduce my cost, and therefore my supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, so to be clear, if we are talking about cost of production or resource cost, when cost of production goes up, then the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, and if the cost of production, this is the original supply curve, this is the new supply curve. Okay, and if the cost of production goes down, now the wages that I pay to the employees, that goes down for some reason, then my cost of production will decrease and I will increase my supply. As a result, my supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, so that's what happens. In case of increase in cost of production, the supply curve will shift to the left. In case of decrease in cost of production, the supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, so that's one of the first factors that will cause shifts in the supply curve. Okay, then let's move on to the next topic, which is the number of producers. This is very easy to understand. Just like, you know, demand had number of buyers, supply has number of producers. If we have more businesses coming into the market producing the same item, what does that mean? That means we are going to have more output, supply will go up, and the supply curve will shift to the right. And if businesses are leaving the market, because let's say they are making losses and just many businesses are leaving the market, so in that case output will fall and supply curve will shift to the left. So number of producers can cause the supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. If there is an increase in the number of producers, supply curve shifts to the right. If there is a decrease in the number of producers, the supply curve shifts to the left. The next one is called the price of production substitutes. Okay, so what is a production substitute? A production substitute is an item that suppliers can produce in place of their current product. So let's say I am producing boots. Instead of boots, I'm going to produce sandals. So they are kind of substitutes to one another. Basically, you know, the materials that I will be using or the labor skills that will be needed to make a boot or the sandal are very similar. Okay, so they are called substitutes. Or another example would be corn or wheat. You know, we are going to need the same amount of land space, we are going to need the same fertilizers and same machines, and we are going to need the same labor skills that we need to grow corn or to grow wheat. So when there is a change in price of the production substitute, my supply will increase. Let's say if there is a change in price of wheat and I produce corn, then if the price of wheat goes up, then there will be a change in supply for corn. Okay, and that will cause a change in the supply, which will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. Okay, now I wanted to show this change in terms of the graph so you guys understand. Okay, so let's say we have two production substitute, wheat and corn. Okay, and now we are given with the supply curves of wheat and corn. Okay, so let's say wheat supply curve looks like this, and then corn's supply curve looks like this. Okay, now let's say 1 ton of corn is sold at $4, and at that we are selling, let's say, 100 units of corn. And again, let's say same thing, wheat $4, and then at that the producers are offering or producing, let's say, 150 units of wheat. Okay, now for some reason in the market, let's say the price of wheat goes down. So for some external reasons the price of wheat goes down. So now what will happen, the farmers who were producing wheat, they are going to make less money because now they can charge lower price as opposed to $4. So they will make less profit, right? Before they were able to charge higher prices and make higher profit, but now the price has fallen down, so their profit has gone down. So the supply will go down to 120 units. So what will happen to these 30 farmers? These 30 farmers will now see that corn is still being sold at $4. There is no change in price, and just instead of using my land to produce wheat, I can just produce corn and make more money, right? That makes rational sense. I don't need many different material, I don't need many different labor skills. I can still use the same fertilizers and machines that I use for wheat production. I can use the same things for corn production. So why not I produce corn instead of wheat? So what these 30 farmers will do is basically they will move here, and this will move to 130. Price has not changed, and therefore the supply curve will shift to the right for corn. So if the price of the production substitutes falls, then the supply curve will shift to the right, and if the price of the production substitute goes up, then the supply curve of the product will shift to the left. So hopefully this example gives you an idea what's going on, because wheat and corn are production substitutes. Now if we take random goods like shoe and fridge, that is not going to make any difference because they are not production substitutes. We only have to look into items that we can produce as substitutes, as I said, you know, like boots or sandals, or wheat or corn, or rice and wheat. So these are all production substitutes because they basically use the same type of labor skills, machines, fertilizers, as well as materials for production. So that's another thing that can cause the supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. Okay, so the next one is called taxes or subsidies. Okay, so if the government implements taxes, what happens? If the government, let's say I am producing cars and now the government imposes a new tax on the production of cars, what happens? For the businesses, the cost of production goes up. So when the cost of production goes up, they are going to cut down their output and supply will fall, so supply curve will shift to the left. So if taxes are increased, supply curve will shift to the left. If taxes are decreased, supply curve will shift to the right. Similarly, subsidies can help or can cause changes in supply. Subsidies basically means these are money or benefits that are given by the government to the businesses in order to increase production. It's basically benefits or some type of payment that the government gives to the suppliers in order to increase production. Let's say for farmers, the government can come in and give subsidies in terms of buying the fertilizers. They can buy the fertilizers for the farmers. So what happens is the cost of production goes down in that case, because right now the farmers will not have to buy fertilizers anymore because government is providing fertilizers to the farmers as subsidies. So cost of production goes down, output will therefore go up, and therefore supply curve will shift to the right. So if there is provision of subsidies, the supply curve will shift to the right, and if there is a decrease in subsidy, the supply curve will shift to the left. And the final factor that causes the supply curve to shift to the right or to the left is technology. Anytime when there is an advancement in technology or there is an innovation in technological arena, or there is a new machine that comes into play that's more efficient, what happens is production goes up, your cost of production goes down, and as a result output goes up and supply curve shifts to the right. So technological advancement or innovations will cause the supply curve to shift to the right because output goes up. On the other hand, technological disruptions will cause the supply to go down. If everybody loses electricity suddenly, then supply will go down, right? So technology plays an important role in determining the supply side. So far we have talked about demand. We understand how the demand works with price and how other factors can affect demand. We also saw the law of supply, how price and quantity supplied are related, and how other factors can affect supply. We also found out how to find out the equation of a demand function and how to find out the equation of supply function. So we have all this information. Now we have to understand what market equilibrium means. Okay, so consumers want to pay lowest prices, but producers want to pay or receive highest prices because they want to make the highest profit, whereas we as consumers, we want to pay as less as possible for the products, right? So market price or equilibrium price is the point where consumers as a group are willing and able to buy exactly the quantity that producers are willing and able to supply. Okay, so basically this is the point where your quantity supplied is equals to your quantity demand, and that's what at the end of the slide you can see. And a market is in equilibrium if your quantity supplied is equal to your quantity demanded. So the price of a product reflects how relatively scarce the product is. If the product is relatively scarce, then the price will be higher, right? If it is difficult to find a product like diamond or gold, then the price will be higher. If it's easily available like water, the price will be very less. Okay, now if there is an increase in when there is a decrease in price, there will be an increase in demand and there will be a decrease in supply. And when there is a decrease in price, there will be when there is an increase in price, there will be a decrease in demand and increase in supply. Okay, so free market allocation, basically in a free market society, the law of demand, which says that price and quantity demanded are inversely related, and the law of supply, which says that price and quantity supplied are positively related, interact with one another to determine the equilibrium output and equilibrium price. The result of this is basically a price where quantity demanded by consumers is exactly equal to the quantity supplied by producers, and the equilibrium price is established where demand curve intersects the supply curve. So I wanted to do a quick example, and I also wanted to do I wanted to show you a graph so you understand how an equilibrium, a market equilibrium looks like. Okay, so when we talk about market equilibrium, basically we are saying that, you know, we all know that on the x-axis we have quantity demand and quantity supplied, because now we are going to plot the demand and supply curve on the same graph, and then on the y-axis we always have price. Okay, we know demand curve is downward sloping curve, and we know supply curve is upward sloping curve. So the point where the supply curve intersects with the demand curve, and that is this point is called the market equilibrium. Okay, so the point where the supply curve will intersect the demand curve is the market equilibrium. So in terms of graph, this is the market equilibrium, and the quantity at this point, this quantity is your equilibrium quantity, this price is your equilibrium price. This is your equilibrium price, this is your equilibrium quantity, this is the place where your quantity supply is equals to quantity demanded. Okay, so hopefully that helps you to understand graphically and see how it looks, you know, how, in terms of graph, how does a market equilibrium look like. Now I also wanted to do another example. Remember, we calculated the demand function and supply function. Let's say we are given with a demand function and supply function. Okay, so let's say, you know, using a table or using a graph, you calculate and you find out that the demand function for a product is given by QD is equals to 20 minus 2P. Let's say that's the one, and this is correct. The value of B is negative because it's a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, and then same way, let's say you find out the equation for the supply function, which is given by, let's say, minus 4 plus 2P. Okay, so this is your demand function, and you know how to calculate this using a table or graph, and this is your supply function, and again you know how to calculate this using a table or graph, which I showed you before. Okay, so now if I give you these two functions and I ask you what is your equilibrium price and quantity, how do you calculate that? Now based on the graph, remember, sorry, this is too small space, let me scroll down a little. Based on the graph, remember, demand curve is downward sloping, supply curve is upward sloping, the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Basically I'm asking what is this and what is this, and look at the graph. This is the place where demand and supply are equal. So if I ask you what is the equilibrium price and quantity, that basically means at equilibrium we have quantity demand is equals to quantity supplied. Okay, so what is the demand function? The quantity demand is given by 20 minus 2P. What is the supply function? Supply function is given as minus 4 plus 2P. So if we interchange, what we are going to get is equals to 4P is equals to 24, or P is equals to $6. Okay, so based on this, the equilibrium price is $6. Okay, so the equilibrium price is $6. And there's another question I did ask, what is the equilibrium quantity? So what I'm trying to say is, what is the value of this Q? So you can take this P and plug it into any of the functions, either in the demand function or in the supply function. You will still get the same result because at this point supply and demand are the same. So just in this example, I will take P is equals to the 6, which is your equilibrium price, and I will plug it in supply function. Okay, just for I mean, if I plug it in the demand function, I will still get the same answer. So QS is equal to minus 4 plus 2 times 6, or equals to 12 minus 4, which is equals to 8. So the equilibrium quantity supplied and the equilibrium quantity demanded is equals to 8. If I ask you to show this in terms of graph, what it basically means is it will look like a graph, a demand graph, a supply curve. This is price, this is demand, and this is supply, and then this is the equilibrium. This is 8 and this is 6. That's exactly what we have calculated, and hopefully that helps you to understand how we can use the demand and supply function to find out the market equilibrium, because at the end of the day we want the market to be at equilibrium, because that is the point where both producers and suppliers, producers and consumers are happy, and we have an efficient market system. So we want it to be at this point in a free market society. Hey. Okay, so moving on. So if the current price of a good is below the equilibrium price, what that means is then quantity demanded by consumers will be more than quantity supplied. So what basically, let's look at it in terms of the graph and I'll try to understand. What it's trying to say is basically, let's say we have a demand and supply curve. Okay, this is demand curve, this is supply curve. X-axis we have price, on the y-axis we have price, and x-axis we have quantity demand and quantity supplied. So in this slide we are basically saying if the current price of a good is below the equilibrium price. So we know the equilibrium price is this, okay, that's the equilibrium price. Now what we are saying, if the current price is below the equilibrium price, let's say the current price in the market is below the equilibrium price. In this case, if you see, the demand will be more and supply will be less, because again prices are low. So what does that mean? Consumers want to buy more of that product because these are very cheap now, whereas producers, they don't have much intense incentive to produce that good because they will not make money out of this, right? Because the price is too low, their profit is going to be too low. So what is happening is this amount, if the difference between QD and QS represents shortage. There is a shortage in the market, right? There is a lot of demand for the product, but there is less supply in the market because the price is below the market equilibrium, and in that case the market will face a shortage. Now when we are at equilibrium, we will not have any shortage or surplus, okay? So that's thing. But how the free market economy will work is basically, in this type of situations, producers will see, hey, there is a lot of demand for my product in the market, so let me increase my production and increase the price a little bit. So they will increase their production and increase their price a little bit. What will happen in turn is now demand will decrease a little bit, right? Because prices have gone up. So that's why demand will go down a little bit. The same process will continue. They will see there is more demand for their product, so they will increase their output, and then they will charge higher prices. In the same way, demand will go down, and this will continue until we come back to equilibrium, until we reach the equilibrium. So in the short run, we can have a situation where the price is less than the equilibrium, but the market mechanisms will adjust automatically. Suppliers and consumers will interact freely and respond based on these changes, and the market will eventually come back to equilibrium in the long run. Okay, so even if there is a shortage in the short run, a free market society will ultimately come back to an equilibrium in the long run. Okay, now another scenario that can happen is if the current market price is above the equilibrium price. So again, let's say we have a demand curve, we have a supply curve, and this is the equilibrium quantity, and this is the equilibrium price. But now let's say we have a price, current price is greater than the equilibrium price. So see, this is greater than the equilibrium price. In this case, what's happening? Your demand is low. Now your demand is low, but your supply is more, right? Because when prices are high, producers will get the incentives to produce and sell more because they're going to make more profit. On the other hand, because prices are too high based on the law of demand, consumers will be discouraged to buy. So in the market, there will be a surplus, and this gap or this gap represents a surplus in the market. So in the previous case, we had a shortage, but in this case, we are going to have a surplus. Now, what is going to happen in the long run? In the case that this scenario exists, what happens is the suppliers will see, oh, my product does not have a whole lot of demand, so I will cut down production and lower my price. So as they cut down production and lower price, the demand in turn goes up because of law of demand. Consumers start demanding more. Now producers again see, hey, I don't have much demand for my product, so they will cut down their price and output further, which in turn will cause the demand to go up, and this will continue until we come back to the equilibrium. So if you see, we can have short-term adjustments, short-term maladjustments in the society, but due to market mechanisms, free interactions of the law of demand and law of supply, the market in the long run will come back to equilibrium. Okay, now other situations can arise. Now slide 18 talks about is the current price is of the good becomes exactly equal to the equilibrium price. That's basically market equilibrium. That's when quantity demanded is equals to quantity supplied, and at this point, this is the point we are talking about. Quantity demand is equals to quantity supplied, and at this point there is no surplus or there is no shortage. Market is perfectly adjusted. Okay, and consumers exactly are willing and able to buy the goods that producers are exactly willing and able to sell. Okay, now other things can happen in the market which can change the equilibrium in the long run or in the short run. Okay, and that is a shift in the demand curve or shift in the supply curve without changes in the price. Okay, so again, if we look at it, let's say we have a demand curve, we have a supply curve. Okay, and this is the current equilibrium in the market. Okay, now let's say for some reason, or let's say the number of there is a migration of people in the city of Dallas and the population of Texas has gone up, so there are more buyers now in the market, so demand has gone up, which has caused the demand curve to shift to the right. Now as the demand curve shifts to the right, what happens to the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium is at point B. If you see now your quantity, new equilibrium quantity and new price quantity because of shifts in the demand curve. Same way the supply curve can shift. Okay, and it's going to be very similar. We have a demand curve, we have a supply curve. Let's say because of tax, government has increased taxes on the producers or on the businesses, and as a result the supply or output will go down, so supply curve will shift to the left, so supply will shift to the left, and what happens is this was your first equilibrium, but now your new equilibrium is point B, which is P2 and Q2. Okay, so shifts in the supply curve or shifts in the demand curve can change the market equilibrium in the short run or in the long run, and whether the equilibrium will yield a increase in price or increase in quantity, or decrease in price or decrease in quantity, will depend on what side the supply curve or the demand curve is shifting. Okay, then we have one final thing that we look into, and we don't focus a whole lot on this because it's a little bit complicated, but what it's basically saying is that when we have a supply and demand curve, let's say we have a demand and supply curve, this is your equilibrium, original equilibrium, then in the market two things can happen at the same time that can cause the demand curve to shift and the supply curve to shift at the same time. Now in that case, what we are trying to say is maybe the number of buyers went up, so the demand curve shifted to the right, but at the same time government increased taxes on business, so the supply curve shifted to the left, and therefore your new equilibrium is at this point. Okay, Q2 P2. Okay, now whether the quantity will increase or decrease, or whether the price will increase or decrease, will depend on the extent of the shift of the supply or the demand curve. If the demand curve shifts more than the supply curve, then we will have one type of result. If the supply curve shifts more than the demand curve, then we will have another type of result. So it's a kind of this is known as complex shifts, because this both supply and demand curves are shifting here. Supply and demand curves are shifting. So that's why it's called complex. We don't need to know much, just we need to know is that demand and supply curve can shift at the same time, and the amount and the new equilibrium will basically depend on the extent of the shift of the demand curve and the supply curve. Now, so far we have learned that the market equilibrium price, or the equilibrium is the equilibrium price is the point that basically it's the point where consumers who are willing and able to pay the market price will get the products from the market. However, at that point, the consumers who are unwilling or unable to pay the price will not receive the product. So even at the equilibrium price, there will be some customers or some consumers who will not be able to afford this product, or who will not be able to get this product or willing to get this product because they cannot afford it, and the same holds true for the suppliers. Maybe there are some suppliers who can produce at a lower price, but they cannot produce at that price, and this for some products this seems a little bit harsh. Let's say healthcare. Now, healthcare is kind of a right for all human beings, right? So if we are allowing a free market system for healthcare, that means there will be some consumers who will not be able to get healthcare services, and there will be some producers who will not be able to provide healthcare services. So that is when the government comes into role, or the government comes into play in the market. In this type of society, there is a blend between free market society and the government is coming in order to help the consumers and producers, so that this type of good is available to everyone. Okay, again, healthcare is an example. We will see two other examples of government interventions, when government comes into the market and tries to set the price. Okay, so what does government intervention mean? Government intervention basically means a direct intervention into the market. The government basically gets into the market and sets the price. Okay, price of the product. They will say, hey, you cannot charge more than this price, or you cannot charge less than this price, okay, to the producers. Now, this policy will definitely affect your quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And then basically government can intervene in the market through prices in two different ways. They can either impose the policy called price ceiling, or they can do price floor. Okay, so what is price ceiling? Price ceiling is when the government sets a legal maximum price on a product in order to keep the price lower than the true equilibrium price, and it is also known as cap. So what it is basically means, price ceiling is when the government comes into the market and says, hey, the market price needs to be less than the equilibrium price, and that's the max price you can charge. You cannot charge more than that price. So when we look at it in terms of the graph, let's say we are looking at it in terms of the graph. So let's say we have a demand curve and supply curve, and let's say this is the equilibrium. Okay, but what it's saying is basically in this type of market, let's say people are unable, some of the consumers are unable to afford the goods, so government will come and say, you cannot charge the equilibrium price. The maximum price you can charge is PC. Okay, this price is the maximum charge. Now, producers, if they want, they can charge lower prices, but this is the maximum price they can charge, and this is known as price ceiling. Basically, it is a cap. That's the maximum price they can charge, and this is a price below the equilibrium price. Now, look at what's happening. When government is saying that the market price is this, what is the supply? Supply is here, demand is there. So there is an excess demand, but there is less supply in the market. So price ceiling ultimately causes shortage in the market. Okay, even though government is trying to help, but it will create some shortages in the market. An example would be the apartment complex industry. Okay, government sets the maximum rent that apartment complexes can charge. So what happens is, even though there are some people who are willing to pay extra for apartment complexes, the businesses cannot charge that because the government has said that, and that is the reason why there will always be a shortage of apartment complexes in the US. Okay, so that's an example of price ceiling. That's one way in which the government can intervene in the market by affecting the price. Okay, the second policy is called the price floor. Now, price floor is created when a government sets a legal minimum price on a product in order to keep the price above the true equilibrium price. And it is also known as the support. So again, if we look at it in terms of graph, what it basically is saying is the price, the price that producers can charge needs to be greater than the equilibrium price, but it cannot be below that price. Okay, so let's again look at this. So this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve. Let's say this is the equilibrium, that's the price, that's the quantity. Okay, now government is coming in and saying, hey, that is the minimum price that you can charge in the market. Now, yes, of course, if you want, you can charge higher prices, but producers can charge, or producers need to charge, this is the minimum they will need to charge in the market. Okay, so what does that create? That creates less demand and more supply, so there is a surplus. This is called price floor, and price floor creates a surplus in the market. An example would be the labor market. Okay, so let's say there will be some people who will be willing to accept work at $5 per hour. However, government has said the minimum hourly wage needs to be 7.25 per hour. Okay, so what that's happening, there will always be an extra there will be the supply of labor will be more, but employers or businesses will want less labor because the cost of production is higher, because they will have to pay higher wages, so their cost of production will go up, and therefore they will not make too much profits, so they don't want to hire that many producers. But on the other hand, because labor will get higher wages, there will be more supply of labor, and so they will demand for more jobs. Okay, so that's an example. So a labor market is a good example of price floor, and price floor ultimately creates a surplus. So remember, price ceiling is a type of government intervention in which the price is below the equilibrium price, and that's the maximum price that the producers can charge, and this creates shortage in the market. Example is the apartment complex industry. And then price floor is basically it's the minimum price that producers can charge. Basically, government is coming in and saying, hey, this is the minimum price you can charge, and that minimum price is above your equilibrium price, and price floor will eventually create a surplus in the market, and labor market is a perfect example of price floor. So that's the end of this chapter. Chapter 3 is complete. In my next video lecture, I will start talking about chapter 4, but hopefully this gives you an idea, and after this lecture you should attempt to try to answer or do the discussion board, because discussion board is related to price ceiling, price floor, and minimum wage, which we just talked about, the labor market. So you want to look at this video lecture, the lecture slides, and then try writing a summary or writing some lines about the discussion boards, the first discussion boards that I have posted on your eCampus. Well, until then, if you have questions, you can email me. Other than that, that's all for today. We will continue from next class. Thank you very much.